Right now, somewhere in the world, a city is settling into silence. Perhaps it is your city. The lights have dimmed, the day's noise has faded, and you have chosen these final quiet moments to travel backward through time to a city that shone brilliantly for only a few generations, yet left an influence that has never really disappeared. Welcome. Tonight, our journey takes us to Athens. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from. Leave a comment with your city, your country, or simply the hour showing on the clock beside you. There is something strangely beautiful about people scattered across the modern world, listening to the same ancient story while living through completely different nights and mornings. Tonight, we are entering the world of classical Athens. The expression "golden age" can sound like something taken directly from a history textbook. Yet the closer we look, the more complicated and more human the period becomes. Athens feels strangely familiar because so many of the ideas associated with modern political life have roots here: democracy, citizenship, philosophy, theater, and arguments about the relationship between individuals and their government. But Athens was also profoundly different from the world we know. Its political system depended on the labor of enslaved people. Women were excluded from formal political participation. Foreign residents could live and work in the city without becoming citizens. And the same society that produced extraordinary art and political thought could also make devastating decisions about other Greek communities. These contradictions are not side notes. They are part of the story. Our journey will cover several centuries, beginning after the collapse of the Bronze Age world. We will watch Greek communities gradually develop the city-state, or polis, and follow Athens as it experiments with a new form of political participation. We will see Persia emerge as a tremendous power to the east. We will follow the battles at Marathon and later the invasion led by Xerxes. We will watch Athens grow richer and more powerful, build its navy, produce remarkable plays and philosophy, and eventually struggle with the consequences of its own success. Along the way, we will keep returning to questions that have no simple answers. Can a democracy maintain an empire without becoming oppressive itself? Does extraordinary cultural achievement tell us anything about the moral character of the society that produced it? And how much of the Athens we remember comes from historical evidence, and how much comes from stories the Athenians created about themselves, and later generations continued to reshape? These are questions better contemplated slowly, so tonight the pace will remain gentle. The scenes may be vivid, but there is no need to hurry. You do not have to remember every name or date. Simply allow the story to move forward. And if sleep arrives before we reach the end, that is perfectly fine. Athens will still be waiting when you return. To understand what Athens eventually became, we first need to look at the world that nearly disappeared. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean experienced a massive period of disruption. The great palace societies of the Bronze Age, including Mycenae and Tiryns, declined or collapsed. Farther east, the Hittite Empire also disappeared, while the trade networks connecting different regions of the Mediterranean weakened dramatically. Historians still debate exactly why this happened. Climate pressures may have played a role. Drought, warfare, migration, rebellion, and political instability may all have contributed. It may have been a chain reaction in which several problems reinforced one another. Whatever the precise combination of causes, the result was profound. Population declined in many areas. Writing disappeared from much of the Greek world. Long-distance commerce became far less important. Communities became smaller and more locally focused. For several centuries, the sophisticated palace societies of the earlier age were gone. Then, slowly, the Greek world began developing again. By roughly the 8th century BCE, a new political form was becoming increasingly important: the polis. The word is often translated simply as city-state, but that description does not capture everything it meant. A polis was not merely a collection of buildings surrounding a town. It was a political community, a population connected by laws, institutions, territory, religious traditions, and a shared sense of belonging. These communities were often small enough for citizens to recognize one another personally. A poor harvest, a military defeat, or a successful trading season could affect the entire community. Geography helped shape this world. Greece is divided by mountains, narrow valleys, islands, peninsulas, and stretches of sea. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there was no enormous river system naturally encouraging the formation of one unified territorial state. Instead, the landscape encouraged fragmentation. Hundreds of independent communities emerged, each developing its own traditions and identity. Neighboring cities could share language and religion while simultaneously competing with one another. Athens grew within this environment. So did Sparta. Sparta developed in the Peloponnese and followed a very different path. While Athens gradually became associated with commerce, political debate, intellectual life, and maritime power, Sparta built its society around military discipline. Its system rested heavily on the subjugation of the neighboring Messenian population. The Spartans maintained control over these communities through a harsh social and military structure, allowing Spartan citizens to devote themselves extensively to warfare and military training. The result was one of the most formidable armies in the Greek world. Sparta became the center of the Peloponnesian League, a network of allied states that extended Spartan influence throughout much of southern Greece. It was conservative, disciplined, and highly militarized. Athens would become its great rival, but early Athens was not yet the legendary city we imagine today. During much of the archaic period, political power remained concentrated among aristocratic families. Large estates were controlled by wealthy landowners, while poor farmers could fall deeply into debt. In some cases, debt could lead to personal enslavement. By the end of the 7th century BCE, social tensions had become extremely serious. Then came Solon, around 594 BCE. The Athenians gave Solon exceptional authority to address the city's political and economic crisis. His reforms were significant, although they did not create equality. He canceled many existing debts and ended debt slavery for Athenian citizens. He also expanded political participation according to wealth, rather than relying entirely on aristocratic birth. But Solon did not completely redistribute land or destroy the power of the wealthy. His reforms addressed part of the crisis without eliminating the underlying social divisions. According to later tradition, Solon eventually left Athens for several years, partly because he did not want to be forced into reversing or expanding his reforms under political pressure. The tensions did not disappear. Instead, Athens entered a period of tyranny. In ancient Greek political language, a tyrant was not necessarily the same thing as the modern meaning of the word. A tyrant was essentially a ruler who had seized power outside the traditional constitutional system Pisistratus, and later his sons controlled Athens for much of the 6th century BCE. Their rule was authoritarian, but it was not simply destructive. They supported religious festivals, public works, and cultural activity, helping strengthen the city's shared identity. The Panathenaic festival, in particular, became an important expression of Athenian civic and religious life. This period left behind a complicated memory. Was the tyrant simply an oppressor, or could a strong ruler also become a builder and benefactor? History rarely makes that distinction as neatly as we might prefer. Eventually, the tyranny weakened. Hippias, the last of the Pisistrated rulers, was expelled in 510 BCE with Spartan assistance. Athens now faced a familiar problem. Who would control the city? Two aristocratic factions competed for influence. One was led by Isagoras, The other was associated with Cleisthenes, a member of the powerful Alcmaeonid family. Cleisthenes understood something important. If Athens simply returned to the old aristocratic system, the same conflict would eventually return. So he attempted something far more ambitious. Rather than merely choosing new leaders, he reorganized the political structure itself. His reforms divided Athenian citizens into 10 new tribes. These tribes were deliberately constructed to combine people from different parts of Attica, the city, the coastal areas, and the inland districts. This weakened the old networks through which aristocratic families had traditionally exercised influence. Under the older system, political loyalties often followed geography and family connections. Cleisthenes scrambled those relationships below. The tribes were local communities known as dems. A deme became an important part of a person's civic identity. It was where citizens were registered and where their connection to the political community was formally recognized. This made citizenship more deeply rooted in local and family identity. From these reforms, developed the institutions that later historians would recognize as the foundations of Athenian democracy. The assembly, known as the ecclesia, became the central gathering of male citizens. Here they debated questions of war, peace, legislation, alliances, and public policy. The meetings took place on the Nyx, a hillside near the Acropolis. In principle, any citizen had the opportunity to speak. In reality, some people were much more persuasive, influential, wealthy, or experienced than others. Even so, the underlying structure was revolutionary. Political decisions could be debated openly before the citizen body. Alongside the assembly stood the Council of 500, or Boule members were selected by lot from the 10 tribes, with each tribe contributing 50 representatives. The council helped prepare matters for the assembly and handled much of the city's daily administration. Selection by lot was not simply an administrative trick. It reflected a deeper Athenian belief. Ordinary citizens should be considered capable of participating in government. The same principle influenced the law courts. Large citizen juries heard cases and made decisions. Rather than relying on a modern-style professional judicial system, the goal was to reduce the ability of a single wealthy or powerful group to dominate every part of government. Then there was ostracism. Once each year, Athenians could decide whether to hold an ostracism vote. If the required process was activated, citizens could write a person's name on a piece of pottery and vote for that individual to be removed. From Athens for 10 years, no criminal conviction was required. The purpose was preventive. If someone appeared to be accumulating dangerous levels of political influence, the community had a mechanism for removing that person before the situation became a larger threat. It was a remarkable political safeguard, although certainly a harsh one. The person who was exiled generally did not lose their property permanently, and after the period of exile they could return. The Athenians understood that they were using a powerful instrument, but democracy had very clear boundaries. The citizens participating in this system were adult male Athenians who met the required conditions of citizenship. Women were not members of the political citizen body, even though they played important roles in religious ceremonies, family life, and the broader social structure of the city. Resident foreigners, known as metics, were also excluded from citizenship despite making major contributions to trade, craftsmanship, and the economy. And beneath the entire system stood a large enslaved population. Slavery was deeply embedded in Athenian society. The precise number of enslaved people is uncertain, but they formed a substantial part of the population and performed work that helped support the economic and social structures of the city. This means the story of Athenian democracy cannot honestly be separated from the story of slavery. Both existed within the same society, religion was equally intertwined with civic life. Major festivals were not simply private acts of worship. They were public occasions through which Athenians expressed their identity as a community. The Panathenaea, the Thesmophoria, and the festivals associated with Dionysus all connected religious practice with public life. At the city Dionysia, dramatic performances became an important part of Athenian culture. Tragedy and comedy were not isolated forms of entertainment. They could explore war, leadership, justice, family, power, pride, and the responsibilities of citizens. The theater, therefore, became another place where Athens could examine itself. The city was, in effect, arguing with itself in public, and that argument never truly ended. There was another important contradiction. The men who guided Athenian democracy were often members of the aristocracy themselves. They possessed education, wealth, family connections, and political experience. Democracy gave citizens the right to vote, but skilled speakers could strongly influence how those citizens understood the choices before them. The popular participation and elite leadership therefore existed side by side. They did not necessarily cancel one another out. Instead, they created a constant tension. That tension would become one of the defining characteristics of Athenian political life. While Athens was experimenting with its new political system, a much larger power was rising far to the east. The Persian Empire expanded across an enormous territory. Under rulers such as Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Darius, Persian authority stretched from Anatolia toward the eastern regions of the empire. This was not simply a loose collection of conquered lands. The Persians developed an organized imperial administration, including satrapies governed by royal officials, roads designed to move information rapidly, and relay stations that allowed messengers to travel great distances. Along the empire's western frontier were the Greek cities of Ionia. Cities such as Miletus and Ephesus shared language, religious traditions, and cultural connections with mainland Greece. Politically, however, they belonged to the Persian Empire for decades. This arrangement remained relatively stable. Then, around 499 BCE, the Ionian Revolt began. Our principal narrative source, Herodotus, describes Aristagoras of Miletus as an important figure in the beginning of the rebellion. The causes were complicated, involving local political tensions, Persian authority, and the ambitions of individual leaders. Several Ionian cities rebelled against Persian control. During the conflict, rebels attacked Sardis, an important Persian center in western Anatolia. Athens chose to support them. Athenian ships crossed the Aegean and participated in the attack, before eventually returning home. Their military contribution was limited. Its political meaning was not. From the Persian perspective, Athens had interfered in the affairs of the empire. Darius eventually suppressed the Ionian revolt. The rebellion failed, and Persian control over the region was restored. According to Herodotus, Darius instructed a servant to remind him repeatedly to remember the Athenians. Whether every detail of that story is literally accurate is impossible to establish, but the larger reality is clear. Athens had now attracted the attention of the Persian king. In 490 BCE, Persian forces crossed the Aegean. Their objectives appear to have included punishing Athens and Eretria for supporting the Ionian rebels and restoring Hippias, the former Athenian tyrant, to power. The Persian army landed at Marathon, a coastal plain northeast of Athens. The Athenians marched to meet them. A small force from Plataea joined them, while Sparta was unable to arrive immediately. According to Herodotus, the Spartans were observing a religious festival and would not march until the appropriate time. Athens therefore faced the Persian army largely on its own. The Athenian commander Miltiades eventually convinced the generals to attack rather than remain behind their defenses. The battle that followed became one of the most famous encounters in ancient history. Athenian hoplites advanced in close formation. These were citizen soldiers rather than a permanent professional army. They carried heavy shields, spears, and armor and relied on maintaining formation. The traditional account says that Miltiades strengthened the wings of his formation while weakening the center. When the two sides met, the Persian center pushed hard against the Athenians, but the stronger Greek flanks eventually turned inward. The Persian army retreated toward its ships. The Athenians had won. The exact casualty figures reported by ancient writers should be treated cautiously, as ancient battlefield numbers were often shaped by literary and political traditions. The famous story of the runner also developed over time. Modern tradition connects marathon with the marathon race, imagining a messenger running from the battlefield to Athens, announcing victory, and dying afterward. Herodotus, however, tells a different story. He describes Pheidippides as a courier who traveled from Athens to Sparta and back before the battle. Later traditions appear to have combined different messenger stories into the dramatic image. Familiar today, it is a useful reminder that historical memory does not simply preserve events, it reshapes them. What is more certain is the importance of the citizen army itself. The men fighting at Marathon were members of the same political community that gathered in the assembly. They were farmers, craftsmen, landowners, and other citizens who could be called upon to defend the city. Their battlefield success depended upon discipline and mutual trust. A hoplite's safety depended partly on the shield carried by the man beside him. The formation worked because the soldiers maintained their position. In that sense, Marathon could be interpreted as a political victory as well as a military one. The citizen body had defended the city. The Athenians quickly began turning the battle into collective memory. A burial mound was raised at Marathon for the fallen soldiers. Their names were remembered by tribal affiliation, reinforcing the idea that the entire citizen body had shared the burden. Artistic representations of the battle appeared in Athens. Marathon became part of the city's political identity. As the decades passed, the victory could be invoked as evidence that Athens had defended Greece when others hesitated. The memory itself became a source of political authority. The message was powerful. Athens had stood against Persia. Athens had survived. Therefore, Athens deserved a leading role among the Greeks. But history requires caution here. Herodotus wrote decades after the battle. He collected stories, compared traditions, traveled widely, and attempted to preserve accounts of events before they disappeared. Yet he was also a storyteller. He shaped his material into a coherent narrative. Speeches, precise battlefield conversations, troop estimates, and dramatic scenes cannot always be treated as direct transcripts of what happened. Archaeology can confirm parts of the broader story. The burial mound at Marathon survives. Evidence of Persian activity has been found in the area. The landscape itself is consistent with the broad outline of the battle, but archaeology cannot tell us exactly what soldiers said to one another before the fighting began. It cannot reconstruct every decision made in the Athenian assembly, and it cannot recover the precise emotions of men standing on the plain at dawn. What we can say with confidence is that by 490 BCE, Athens had become entangled with the greatest imperial power of its age. It had intervened in a distant Greek rebellion. It had survived a Persian expedition, and ordinary citizens had played a central role in that defense. The Athenians would remember Marathon for generations, but the next Persian invasion would be far larger, and this time, Athens would need something more than an army on land. It would need a fleet. Marathon, had demonstrated what Athens could achieve on the battlefield. Now, one Athenian politician was looking toward the sea. His name was Themistocles. He was ambitious, politically sharp, and far less concerned with preserving the old balance of power than many of his rivals. Themistocles argued that Athens should invest heavily in naval power. A trireme was very different. From the heavily armored hoplite formation, it was a long, narrow warship designed around speed, maneuverability, and coordinated rowing. A fully crewed vessel required a large number of men, with rowers making up a substantial part of the crew. Many of these rowers came from the poorer sections of Athenian society. This mattered enormously. Building a large navy meant giving poorer citizens a central role in the defense of the state. Military power was no longer concentrated only in the hands of wealthy landowners who could afford armor and horses. The lower classes became essential to the city's survival. That had political consequences. Around 483 BCE, Athens experienced an unexpected financial opportunity. The silver mines at Laurion produced a particularly valuable discovery. The city suddenly had a choice. The money could be distributed among citizens, or it could be invested in something much larger. Themistocles pushed for the second option. He argued that the silver should be used to build a powerful navy. Persia had not disappeared after Marathon. Another invasion remained possible. Athens also had a regional rival in Aegina, a powerful island community with a strong naval tradition. Themistocles presented the naval program in terms that could appeal to immediate Athenian concerns while preparing the city for a much larger danger. The assembly approved the plan. Athens began constructing a major fleet. The decision changed the city. The poorer citizens who served as rowers became essential to military strategy. Their labor kept the ships moving. Their service helped defend Athens, and their growing importance strengthened the political significance of the lower classes within the democracy. Silver, naval power, and democratic politics were becoming closely connected. Then, in 486 BCE, Darius died. His son Xerxes inherited the Persian throne and the unresolved conflict with Greece. Over the following years, Persia prepared for a massive campaign. Ancient sources give enormous figures for the invading forces, but modern historians generally regard the largest numbers as exaggerated. Even so, the expedition was immense by Greek standards. Bridges were constructed across the Hellespont. A canal was cut through the Athos. Peninsula supplies had to be transported across enormous distances. From the Persian perspective, this was not merely a military operation, it was also a demonstration of imperial power. The Greeks responded slowly. Different cities had different interests. Some considered submission, others resisted. Eventually, a coalition began to form, with Sparta taking the leading role on land and Athens becoming especially important at sea. The first famous confrontation occurred at Thermopylae in 480 BCE. The strategy was straightforward. The Greeks hoped to use a narrow mountain passage to prevent the much larger Persian force from making effective use of its numerical advantage. King Leonidas of Sparta led a small force of Spartans and allied troops. For a time, the narrow terrain favored the defenders, but Persian forces eventually found a route around the Greek position. The defenders were surrounded and defeated. Thermopylae soon became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. Later generations transformed the battle into a powerful story about freedom, courage, and choosing death rather than submission. The historical reality was more complicated than the legend, but the symbolism proved extraordinarily durable. For the Greeks living through the invasion, however, there was little time for reflection. The Persian army had broken through the pass. The road toward Central and southern Greece was open. Xerxes' forces could now continue south, and Athens itself stood directly in their path. The Greek fleet and the constant arguments over strategy finally gave way to action. In Athens, the plan that Themistocles had been advocating now reached its most difficult consequence. If the city's real strength lay in its navy, then the survival of its people might require them to leave their homes behind. The Athenians evacuated. Citizens crossed by boat to nearby Salamis and other places of safety. Some traveled even farther. Not everyone abandoned the city. A few remained behind, including people connected to the sanctuaries and those unwilling to leave their homes. But most of the population withdrew. When the Persian forces entered Attica, they found Athens largely deserted. The Acropolis was captured, and temples and houses were set ablaze. For the Athenians watching from across the water as smoke rose from their sacred hill, this was more than a military defeat. It was a profound emotional shock, the destruction of the places that carried their memories, their gods, and their sense of continuity. Amid this displacement, with refugees crowded along the shores and aboard ships, Themistocles once again argued his case. The war, he insisted, would be decided at sea. The Greek fleet, including Athenians, Corinthians, Aeginetans, and other contingents, gathered around the island of Salamis. But the dispute was no longer simply about tactics. It was also about trust. Many Peloponnesian commanders wanted to retreat southward toward the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could defend the Peloponnese itself. Themistocles argued instead that the fleet should remain in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland. In open sea, he warned, Persian numerical superiority would be overwhelming. In the confined channels around Salamis, however, the smaller and more maneuverable Greek triremes could make better use of their training and coordination. Ancient writers also preserve a dramatic part of the story. According to these accounts, Themistocles secretly sent a message to Xerxes, claiming that the Greeks were divided and preparing to escape. The message supposedly encouraged the Persian king to move his fleet into the straits during the night. Whether the deception happened exactly as later writers described it is uncertain. What is much clearer is what happened next. By dawn, Persian ships had entered waters where their enormous numbers became a disadvantage rather than an advantage. The battle that followed was chaotic. Greek contingents did not always cooperate perfectly, and rivalries remained between different groups. Yet courage, preparation, and geography combined to give the Greeks an important advantage. In the narrow waters, the triremes could operate in tighter formations. Greek ships rammed and struck the more crowded Persian fleet, turning the sea itself into both battlefield and graveyard. From the shore, Xerxes was said to have watched his fleet struggle. Ancient sources may have dramatized the scene, but the strategic consequences are much harder to dispute. With his navy badly damaged, Xerxes could no longer easily supply and support a huge army operating deep inside hostile Greek territory. Within months, he withdrew the greater part of his forces, leaving his general Mardonius behind with a substantial army to continue the campaign. The war, however, was not finished. It had simply entered another phase. The final major clashes came in 479 BCE, on land at Plataea in Boeotia. A Greek coalition made up of Spartans, Athenians, and other forces confronted and defeated Mardonius. The precise details remain debated, the exact movements of the armies, the balance between Spartan discipline and Athenian aggression, and the decisions made during the battle. But the outcome was decisive enough to force Persian land forces out of central Greece. Around the same period, Greek forces also attacked Persian positions on the coast of Asia Minor, near Mycale, close to a Persian camp and a fleet whose ships had been drawn onto the shore. The Greeks achieved another important victory. This battle carried an additional historical resonance. The fighting took place near the homeland of the Ionian Greek cities, whose earlier revolt had helped begin the long chain of conflicts between Greece and Persia. With Plataea and Mycale, the immediate threat to mainland Greece finally receded. The Persian Empire was still enormous. Its territory stretched across vast regions, and the great king remained one of the most powerful rulers in the known world. Yet the idea that the Greek mainland was destined to fall under Persian domination no longer seemed inevitable. For Athens, the significance of Themistocles' gamble was now becoming unmistakable. The silver discovered at Laurion had not simply funded prosperity, it had helped purchase survival. The navy had protected a population that had temporarily lost its own city. The men who sat at the oars, many of them ordinary citizens of modest wealth, had become central to the defense of Athens and to the wider Greek victory. Athens was changing. It was no longer simply the city remembered for the hoplites who had fought at Marathon. It was becoming the city of Salamis, the city whose citizens had watched their temples burn and then fought back from the sea. That memory would shape Athens' ambitions, strengthen its claims to leadership, and eventually create new tensions with its former allies. For the moment, however, the Persian storm had been survived. The question facing the Greek world was no longer simply how to remain alive. It was what the Greeks would do with the power, influence, and prestige that victory had placed in their hands. When the last Persian forces withdrew toward Asia, Greece did not suddenly become peaceful. Cities had been destroyed, fields had been burned, sanctuaries had been violated. The memory of evacuation and of watching smoke rise above sacred hills remained painfully fresh. Victory had brought pride, but not complete security. Out of this combination of fear, opportunity, and shared purpose emerged a new experiment in collective power: the Delian League. The alliance took its name from Delos, a small and sacred island in the Aegean associated with Apollo and Artemis. Its religious importance made it appear to be a suitable and relatively neutral location for the alliance's treasury and meetings. The member states swore oaths of cooperation. According to ancient tradition, iron objects were thrown into the sea as symbolic promises that the alliance would last until those objects resurfaced. The League's stated objectives were straightforward: keep Persia away from the Aegean, liberate Greek communities that remained under Persian control, and seek compensation for the destruction caused by the war. But ambitious goals required an organized system. Rather than requiring every member city to provide the same number of ships and soldiers, most members eventually contributed money. These annual payments were assessed as tribute, while Athenian officials known as Hellenotamiai supervised the financial records. In theory, the Delian League was a partnership of allied states under Athenian leadership. In practice, Athens increasingly controlled its decisions. Athenian officials helped determine military campaigns, directed the fleet, and supervised the League's finances. The arrangement initially suited many members. Persia remained a major threat, and Athens had demonstrated the power of its navy at Salamis and Mycale. For smaller states, joining the League could therefore be practical. They could rely on Athenian naval protection without maintaining an expensive fleet of their own. But over time, the relationship changed. Some member states began to question the financial burden and the growing authority of Athens. Naxos, an island member, attempted to withdraw. Athens responded with military pressure, eventually forcing the island back into the League and stripping it of much of its independence. Thasos later challenged Athenian authority as well. Wealthy through its mines and commercial interests, the island resisted growing Athenian interference and eventually revolted. Athens answered with a siege. After a long struggle, Thasos surrendered its fleet, accepted heavy financial penalties, and remained within the League. The pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. What had begun as a defensive alliance was developing the characteristics of an empire. Yet the League still performed the military purpose for which it had originally been created. Under the leadership of Cimon, son of the famous Miltiades of Marathon, League forces launched successful campaigns against Persian positions in the Aegean and along the coast of Asia Minor. Cimon expelled Persian garrisons from important locations and achieved a celebrated victory at the Eurymedon River, where Greek forces defeated the Persians by land and sea. These campaigns helped make the Aegean safer for Greek merchants and settlements. Persian influence was pushed back from significant portions of the coast. For many allied cities, these victories were genuine benefits. The tribute they paid helped maintain fleets that, at least during the League's early decades, were doing exactly what they had been created to do, restricting Persian power. But Cimon's successes also reinforced Athens' special position. The admirals were increasingly Athenian. The strategic decisions were increasingly made in Athens, and over time, the fleet itself became overwhelmingly Athenian. Many cities that had once supplied their own ships discovered that paying money was easier. Athens could provide the sailors, commanders, and vessels. That convenience, however, had a hidden cost. Every city that stopped maintaining its own naval force became more dependent on Athens. The transformation became especially clear when the League's treasury was eventually moved from Delos to Athens. The official justification was security. Delos was vulnerable, and Athens possessed stronger defenses and a powerful fleet. But once the League's treasury was placed on the Athenian Acropolis, the distinction between common League resources and Athenian wealth became increasingly difficult to maintain. Athens began using League resources for more than military operations. The money supported public payments, festivals, and eventually ambitious construction projects that transformed the city's appearance. The allies could complain, but resisting Athens was becoming increasingly dangerous. Athens also developed other methods of maintaining control. It established klerouches, settlements of Athenian citizens on land connected to allied communities. These settlers retained their Athenian citizenship and could function as a form of local military and political presence. In some cities, governments friendly to Athens were supported or encouraged. Garrisons and pro-Athenian political groups created a network of influence that became difficult for rebellious states to escape. Tribute lists were carved into stone, recording the amounts each member was expected to contribute. For an island that had once considered itself an equal partner, seeing its obligation permanently inscribed in Athenian stone could be a powerful reminder of the new hierarchy. But how inevitable was this transformation? Historians disagree. Some argue that empire was almost built into the structure of the alliance. A military coalition needed a leading power, and Athens possessed the largest fleet. Once smaller states chose money instead of ships, they gradually surrendered the practical ability to leave. Add the memory of the Persian invasion, Athenian ambition, economic interests, and the desire for security, and the emergence of an Athenian empire becomes easier to understand. Others emphasize contingency. They point to individual decisions, the naval vision of Themistocles, the campaigns of Cimon, the later leadership of Pericles, the harsh treatment of Naxos and Thasos, the decision to move the treasury, and the willingness to spend allied resources on projects inside Athens. Under different leaders, or if important allies had resisted more effectively, the League might have remained a looser federation rather than becoming an empire. What matters most is how the transformation appeared to people living through it. Many Athenians believed their city had earned leadership through sacrifice at Salamis and Plataea. To them, tribute and obedience could appear to be a legitimate reward for the city that had helped save Greece. For many allies, however, the story gradually took on a darker meaning. Liberation from Persia had slowly become dependence on Athens. The same Athenian triremes that once arrived as protectors could now appear offshore as instruments of enforcement. Between these two perspectives, tension continued to grow. The alliance had become an empire, and with empire came confidence, entitlement, and fear of rebellion. The sea routes were safer. Athens' influence stretched farther. Wealth flowed toward the city, but the price of that power, for Athens and for the communities under its influence, was only beginning to become clear. As the Delian League hardened into an empire, a different kind of Athenian leader emerged, Pericles. He did not resemble the older generation of aristocratic military heroes. Cimon carried the prestige of his father's victory at Marathon. Themistocles had the reputation of a bold and unconventional political outsider. Pericles was more controlled. Born into a powerful family and educated in an intellectual environment shaped by philosophy and rhetoric, he approached politics as a long-term contest. He did not become ruler by overthrowing democracy. Instead, he learned how to master its institutions. Athens had no single monarch who could simply command the state. Public offices were numerous, terms were generally limited, and major decisions were debated by the citizen assembly. Pericles' strength came from his ability to shape the political agenda, persuade large audiences, and repeatedly win election as a general. One of his most important political developments was the expansion of payment for public service. For an ordinary farmer, craftsman, or laborer, spending a day serving on a jury or participating in civic government could mean losing a day's income. By providing payment for certain forms of public service, Athens made participation easier for citizens who could not afford to give up their wages. Democracy, in this sense, became more accessible, but it also became more intense. More citizens could participate, more factions competed for their support. More speeches were delivered in an effort to influence public opinion. The political arena became louder, more competitive, and increasingly dependent on skilled speakers who could persuade large crowds. At the same time, Athenian citizenship itself became more restricted. Around 451–450 BCE, a citizenship law associated with Pericles required that both parents of a citizen be Athenians. Previously, an Athenian father could generally provide the basis for citizenship even when the mother came from outside Athens. The new rule narrowed the definition of who could belong to the citizen body. It also made it harder for elite Athenians to marry foreigners while still producing children who automatically received full citizenship. The distinction between citizens and the many non-citizen residents, workers, allies, and foreigners living within Athens became sharper. Why was the law introduced? Some historians connect it to the growing value of citizenship within an expanding empire. As Athens became wealthier and more powerful, citizenship carried greater privileges. Others emphasize concerns about ancestry, social solidarity, or the desire to define more clearly who shared the burdens and benefits of the Athenian state. Whatever the precise motivation, the result was paradoxical. Athens expanded political participation among its citizens while simultaneously making citizenship itself more exclusive. Beyond the city, another major tension was growing. Sparta remained the leading power of the Peloponnesian League. Its military strength rested heavily on disciplined hoplite infantry and a conservative social order. To Sparta and many of its allies, Athens' radical democracy and expanding naval empire looked unstable and increasingly threatening. To many Athenians, Spartan austerity and suspicion appeared to be a permanent obstacle to their city's ambitions. These tensions surfaced through disputes involving Corinthian colonies and the conflicts later grouped under the name First Peloponnesian War. The fighting was not one continuous struggle but a series of campaigns, alliances, and uneasy truces. Cities on both sides watched carefully, trying to determine which great power would better protect their interests or at least threaten them less. Every alliance and intervention added another strand to a growing web of mistrust. Within this tense environment, Pericles developed a strategy that matched both Athens' strengths and its fears. He understood that Athens could not easily defeat Sparta in a direct land battle, Spartan hoplites, trained from an early age, were among the most formidable infantry forces in Greece. But Sparta was far less powerful at sea. Its resources were more limited, its naval strength was weaker, and its political center lay inland. Pericles' strategy rested on three main pillars. First came sea power. The Athenian fleet, financed partly through tribute and manned by citizens and allies, could project force along the Aegean coastline, protect trade, and keep vital grain routes open. As long as the ships continued to sail, Athens could continue to eat, trade, and survive. Second came the walls. Massive fortifications connected Athens with its port at Piraeus. These became known as the Long Walls. Even if Spartan armies invaded Attica and destroyed the countryside, the population could retreat behind the fortifications while supplies continued to arrive by sea. Athens could effectively become an island on land. Third was the avoidance of a decisive land battle. Pericles understood that if Athens met the Spartan army in a traditional hoplite confrontation, Sparta would probably have the advantage. His strategy therefore called for patience. Let the Spartans burn the fields. Do not give them the decisive battle they wanted. Instead, rely on time, money, fortifications, and naval superiority to gradually wear down the enemy. Our most important portrait of Pericles and his strategy comes from the historian Thucydides. His work preserves famous speeches attributed to Pericles, including arguments defending Athenian policy, and the celebrated funeral oration honoring those who died for Athens. These speeches have profoundly influenced how later generations imagine both Pericles and classical Athens, but Thucydides himself warns us about their exact wording. He does not claim to reproduce every speech word for word. Instead, he reconstructs what he believed was appropriate to the circumstances. That creates an important historical question. How much of Pericles' actual voice do we hear? And how much belongs to Thucydides himself, his own reflections on power, democracy, leadership, and human nature? Some scholars treat the funeral oration as a close representation of Periclean political thought, preserving the confidence of Athens at the height of its power. Others see it as partly a carefully constructed portrait created by Thucydides to reveal both the brilliance and the weaknesses of Athenian self-confidence. The same uncertainty applies to the speeches about empire. Are they accurate summaries of Pericles' arguments? Or are they Thucydides' attempt to express the logic behind Athenian behavior? What we can say with greater confidence is this. Through Thucydides, Pericles emerges as the symbol of Athens at the height of its power, eloquent, strategic, calculating, and convinced that a united citizen body backed by ships and walls could shape the future of Greece. But that confidence would soon face the hardest possible tests: war, disease, political pressure, and the limits of human foresight. Even while Pericles concentrated on fleets, walls, and military strategy, another ambitious project was taking shape above the city: the rebuilding of the Acropolis. Decades earlier, the Persian invasion had destroyed Athens' temples and left a deep wound in the city's collective memory. For years, Athenians debated what should be done with the ruins. Some believed the damaged temples should remain as permanent reminders of Persian destruction and sacrilege. Under Pericles, that hesitation gave way to another vision. The scars of the past could become monuments to recovery, confidence, and power. The rebuilding program served several purposes at once. It was religious, a way to honor the gods, especially Athena, the patron goddess of Athens. It was political, an assertion that Athens, rather than Sparta, was becoming the cultural center of Greece. And it was economic. Construction created work for stonecutters, carpenters, sculptors, bronze workers, haulers, and sailors transporting marble from distant quarries. Public spending on temples effectively created employment for thousands. For ordinary citizens, gleaming new buildings provided a visible reminder of the wealth flowing into Athens through its empire. At the center of this monumental transformation stood the Parthenon, the great temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Maiden. On one level, it was an act of religious devotion. Inside stood a colossal cult statue of Athena, armed and majestic, holding Nike, the personification of victory, in her hand. Created under the direction of the sculptor Phidias, the statue used gold and ivory, making it both a sacred image and a remarkable store of valuable material. On another level, the Parthenon was a spectacle. Its enormous scale, carefully proportioned columns, precise architecture, and extraordinary quantity of marble communicated something to every visitor who saw it. Athens possessed not only devotion, but wealth, not only artistic taste, but political power. Phidias, who oversaw much of the sculptural program, helped push Greek art toward a new level of sophistication. The Greek fleet pulled back, and the constant arguments over strategy became more urgent. In Athens, the plan Themistocles had defended was now reaching its harshest conclusion. If the city's greatest strength was its navy, then survival might require the Athenians to abandon the city itself, and that is exactly what happened. The Athenians evacuated their homes. Families crossed the water to nearby Salamis and other places of safety. Some traveled even farther. Not everyone left. A few remained behind, especially around the city's sacred places. But most of the population withdrew. When the Persian army entered Attica, it found Athens largely deserted. The Acropolis was captured. Temples and houses were burned. For the Athenians watching from across the water, smoke rising from their sacred hill must have been devastating. This was not simply the loss of buildings. It was the destruction of places connected to their gods, their memories, and their identity. Yet even as Athens burned, Themistocles continued to argue that the war would be decided at sea. The Greek fleet gathered around Salamis. Athenian ships were joined by Corinthians, Aeginetans, and other Greek contingents. But the disagreement among the commanders was intense. Many Peloponnesian leaders wanted to withdraw toward the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could defend the peninsula. Themistocles argued for something very different. He wanted the fleet to remain in the narrow waters around Salamis. His reasoning was simple. In open sea, the enormous Persian fleet could make full use of its numerical advantage. But in the confined channels around Salamis, that advantage could become a weakness. Greek triremes could maneuver more effectively, attack in formation, and use the restricted waters to prevent the Persians from surrounding them. Ancient writers also preserve a dramatic story about Themistocles sending a secret message to Xerxes. According to the tradition, he claimed that the Greeks were divided and preparing to escape, encouraging the Persian king to bring his fleet into the narrow straits. Whether the deception happened exactly as later sources describe it is uncertain, but the result is much clearer. When daylight came, Persian ships were packed into waters where their overwhelming numbers became difficult to use. The battle that followed was chaotic. The Greek contingents did not always cooperate perfectly, and rivalries remained between different cities. But position, preparation, and experience gave the Greek fleet a crucial advantage. The smaller and more maneuverable triremes struck at the crowded Persian formation. Ships collided or shattered. Crews struggled for control as the narrow waters became filled with wreckage and confusion. The sea itself became both battlefield and graveyard. From the shore, Xerxes is said to have watched his fleet suffer. Ancient accounts may have dramatized the scene, but the strategic consequences were real. With a large part of his navy damaged or destroyed, Xerxes could no longer easily maintain his enormous army deep inside hostile Greek territory. The Persian king eventually withdrew with much of his force, leaving the general Mardonius behind with a substantial army. The invasion was not yet finished. The following year, in 479 BCE, the Greek coalition confronted Mardonius at Plataea in Boeotia. Spartans, Athenians, and other Greek forces fought together and defeated the Persian army. The exact details of the battle remain debated, but its importance is not. Persian land forces withdrew from central Greece. Around the same time, Greek forces won another victory near Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. There, close to a Persian camp and its beached ships, Greek forces struck again. The cycle of conflict that had begun with the Ionian revolt was now turning in a very different direction. The Persian Empire remained enormous. Its territories stretched across much of the known world. But the idea that the Greek mainland was destined to fall under the control of the great king no longer seemed inevitable. For Athens, the meaning of Themistocles' gamble had become unmistakable. The silver from Laurion had not purchased luxury, it had purchased survival. The fleet had protected a people who had temporarily lost their own city. The men pulling the oars, many of them ordinary citizens, had become essential to the survival of Athens and to the wider Greek resistance. Athens was no longer remembered only as the city of the hoplites who had fought at Marathon. It was becoming the city of Salamis, the city that had watched its temples burn, evacuated its homes, and then fought back from the sea. That memory would shape Athens for generations. Victory over Persia brought enormous prestige, but it also created a new question. What should the Greeks do with the power they had gained? The answer soon emerged in the form of the Delian League. The alliance took its name from the sacred island of Delos, associated with Apollo and Artemis. It appeared to offer a neutral and religiously meaningful place where the Greek states could organize their continued resistance against Persia. The member cities swore oaths and established a common treasury. Their stated objectives were straightforward: keep Persia away from the Aegean, liberate Greek communities still under Persian control, and secure compensation for the devastation caused by the invasion. At first, the arrangement looked like a partnership, but practical power quickly complicated the ideal. Instead of every member contributing the same number of ships and soldiers, many cities began paying money instead. Athenian officials assessed the contributions and kept the League's accounts. In theory, the League remained a coalition of independent cities. In practice, Athens was becoming its center. Athens controlled the largest fleet. Its commanders directed many of the campaigns. Its ships increasingly carried out the fighting, while other members found it easier to contribute money instead. That arrangement was convenient. It was also dangerous. Once a city stopped maintaining its own fleet, it became increasingly dependent on Athens for its security. And dependence made withdrawal much harder. The first major warning signs appeared when members attempted to leave. Naxos tried to withdraw from the League, and Athens responded with force, eventually compelling the island to remain within the alliance. Thasos later challenged Athenian authority as well. The island was wealthy and commercially important, but Athens responded with a long siege. Thasos eventually surrendered its fleet and accepted heavy financial penalties. The pattern was becoming clear. What had begun as a defensive alliance was gradually acquiring the characteristics of an empire. Yet, the League still performed its original military purpose. Under the leadership of Cimon, son of Miltiades, Athenian-led forces continued campaigning against Persia across the Aegean and along the coast of Asia Minor. These victories were genuine. Persian garrisons were driven from important positions. Greek shipping became safer. Persian influence along parts of the Aegean coastline weakened. For many members of the League, this protection was valuable. But every victory also strengthened Athens. Athenian admirals commanded the fleet, Athenian strategists planned campaigns, and as more allies chose to pay money instead of providing ships, Athens became even more dominant. Eventually, the League's treasury was transferred from Delos to Athens. The official explanation was security. Delos was vulnerable, while Athens possessed powerful walls and a large navy, but once the treasury arrived in Athens, the distinction between common League resources and Athenian wealth became increasingly difficult to maintain. Athens began using League funds not only for military purposes, but also for public payments, festivals, and eventually magnificent construction projects. The city was transforming. The wealth of the alliance was becoming visible in marble. Athens also established clerishes, settlements of Athenian citizens placed on allied territory. These communities maintained their Athenian identity and could reinforce Athenian influence. In other cities, governments friendly to Athens were supported or encouraged. Garrisons strengthened control. Tribute assessments were recorded on stone for the allies. The message was unmistakable. They were no longer simply partners standing beside Athens. They were increasingly subjects of a growing power. Historians still debate how inevitable this transformation really was. Perhaps an alliance built around the strongest navy naturally encouraged one city to dominate. Once smaller states surrendered their fleets in exchange for financial contributions, they also surrendered much of their ability to resist. But the empire was not created automatically. Individual decisions mattered. The policies of Themistocles, Cimon, and later Pericles all shaped Athens' growing power. So did the decisions to punish rebellious allies, move the treasury, and spend allied wealth on projects within Athens itself. For many Athenians, this seemed justified. Their city had sacrificed its homes and treasures in the Persian Wars. Its citizens had fought at Marathon and rode at Salamis. From their perspective, leadership was something Athens had earned. For many allies, however, the story became darker. Liberation from Persia had gradually turned into dependence on Athens. The same Athenian ships that had once appeared as protectors could now appear offshore as enforcers. And within this changing world, a new leader rose to define Athens. His name was Pericles. Unlike the daring Themistocles or the celebrated military figure Cimon, Pericles presented himself as controlled, deliberate, and deeply political. He came from a prominent family, received an education influenced by philosophers and rhetoric, and learned to operate within Athens' increasingly powerful democratic system. He did not need to become a tyrant. Instead, he learned how to influence thousands of citizens through speeches, alliances, and political strategy. Athens had no single ruler. Important decisions were made through the assembly, where large numbers of citizens could participate. Pericles' strength was his ability to shape the debate. He could present long-term policies as common sense, persuade citizens to accept difficult choices, and repeatedly win election as one of the city's generals. One of the important developments during his political career was the expansion of payment for public service. For poorer citizens, attending a jury or serving in public office could mean losing a day's income. Payment made participation easier. Democracy became more accessible to ordinary citizens, but it also became more competitive. More people could participate. More politicians had to persuade them. Speeches became increasingly important, and skilled orators gained enormous influence over public opinion. At the same time, Athens tightened the boundaries of citizenship. Around the middle of the 5th century BCE, a new citizenship law required both parents of a citizen to be Athenians. The rules strengthened the distinction between citizens and the many foreigners, residents and allies who lived and worked in Athens. It was a strange paradox. Political participation was expanding among citizens, while citizenship itself was becoming more exclusive. Beyond Athens, Another power watched carefully. Sparta remained the leader of the Peloponnesian League. Its strength rested on disciplined hoplite infantry and a conservative social order. To many Spartans and their allies, Athens' radical democracy and growing naval empire looked dangerous. To Athenians, Spartan conservatism appeared equally threatening. Neither side fully trusted the other. Disputes involving Corinth, Megara, and other allied states gradually increased the tension. Campaigns and temporary truces created an atmosphere in which every new alliance seemed to carry the possibility of another conflict. Pericles understood the basic strategic reality. Athens could not easily defeat Sparta in a direct land battle. Spartan hoplites were among the most formidable infantry forces in Greece, but Athens possessed something Sparta lacked: a powerful navy. Pericles' strategy rested on three main ideas. First came sea power. The Athenian fleet could protect trade, raid enemy territory, and keep the vital grain routes open. As long as the ships controlled the sea, Athens could continue to feed itself and maintain its economy. Second came the long walls. These massive fortifications connected Athens with the port of Piraeus. If Spartan armies invaded Attica and destroyed the countryside, the population could retreat behind the walls while supplies continued to arrive by sea. Athens could, in effect, become an island on land. Third came patience. Pericles understood that Athens should avoid giving Sparta the decisive land battle it wanted. Let the Spartans burn the countryside. Let them demonstrate their strength. Athens would survive behind its walls, relying on its fleet, its wealth, and its reserves. Over time, Pericles believed, those advantages would wear Sparta down. Our most important source for this period is the historian Thucydides. He preserves speeches attributed to Pericles, including arguments about empire, war, and the famous funeral oration. But there is an important warning. Thucydides did not claim to reproduce every speech word for word. He explained that he reconstructed speeches according to what he believed was appropriate for each situation. So when we hear Pericles speaking through Thucydides, we are hearing something more complicated than a simple transcript. How much belongs to Pericles? How much belongs to Thucydides? The answer is impossible to know with certainty, yet through those speeches, Pericles emerges as the symbol of Athens at the height of its confidence, eloquent, strategic, ambitious, and convinced that a united citizen body supported by ships, walls, and wealth could shape the Greek world. But that confidence was about to face its greatest tests: war, disease, and the limits of human planning. Even while Pericles was building a strategy based on ships and walls, another transformation was taking place on the sacred hill above Athens. The Acropolis was being rebuilt. The Persian invasion had destroyed the earlier temples, leaving behind ruins that carried the memory of defeat. For years, Athenians had debated what those ruins should mean. Should they remain as reminders of Persian destruction, or should Athens rebuild them into something greater? Under Pericles, the second vision gradually prevailed. The scars of war would become monuments to recovery. The rebuilding program served several purposes at once. It was religious, honoring Athena, the city's patron goddess. It was political, proclaiming the power and confidence of Athens. And it was economic. Construction provided work for stonemasons, carpenters, sculptors, metalworkers, transporters, and many others. The wealth flowing into Athens was being transformed into stone. At the center of this monumental program stood the Parthenon, the great temple dedicated to Athena Parthenos. Inside stood the enormous cult image of Athena created by Phidias. The goddess was represented with weapons and armor, holding the figure of Nike, the embodiment of victory. Gold and ivory made the statue shine. The temple itself was equally impressive. Its proportions were carefully designed, its columns subtly adjusted and its sculptures filled with movement and human detail. Gods, heroes, horsemen, and mythological scenes appeared across the marble. The stone seemed alive. Athenians were presenting themselves not merely as citizens of a powerful city, but as a people whose festivals, traditions, victories, and identity belonged within a larger sacred story. And the Acropolis was only one part of this transformation. Below the sacred hill, the theater of Dionysus welcomed thousands during festivals. There, under the open sky, Athenians watched tragedies and comedies explore war, justice, family, politics, and the behavior of the city itself. Even poorer citizens could attend. Through public support, these performances were more than entertainment. They were a way for the city to examine itself. Citizens could mourn fictional kings, laugh at politicians, question their leaders, and confront the fears created by democracy and empire. Culture had become political, beauty had become a language of power, yet not everyone approved. Some allies looked toward Athens and saw their tribute transformed into marble temples and magnificent sculptures. They wondered why money supposedly collected for defense against Persia was being used to glorify another city. Even within Athens, critics questioned whether public wealth should be turned into monuments. Pericles defended the projects, arguing that as long as Athens continued fulfilling its military responsibilities, it had the right to decide how its resources were spent. But his opponents saw something more troubling. They saw imperial wealth being transformed into Athenian glory, and that question would remain at the heart of Athens' golden age. Was this the reward of victory or the beginning of empire?